This is the Middle-earth Philosopher, where I talk about ideas, people, and relationships within the world of Middle-earth and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view that may have existed in that world at that time. Within the philosophies of Middle-earth, few things are as highly valued or praised as the idea of wisdom. Its value and praise upon whoever has it crosses multiple ages, races, and genders, and at first it seems rather simple to understand why and what it is. However, an interesting point is that in that world, a distinction is made between wisdom and knowledge, and I want to explore that distinction and how people may have viewed it as well. Within the context of this universe, wisdom seems to be an ambiguous idea that applies to the application of knowledge, information, events, and power. Moreover, it seems to be exclusive to what we fans would call the good guys of Middle-earth. For example, the Valar are considered by those who know their existence to be wise. As far as some of the Maiar that serve and coexist with them, in particular, those who come to Middle-earth, the wizards, or as they are called, the Astari, are also considered wise. The High Elves of the Vanyar clan in Valinor, as well as the children of the Noldor High King in Valinor, Finarfin, are considered the wisest among the elves within the world at that time. There is even an implication that Finarfin's children are also considered the wisest among the Noldor because, in part, of their Vanyar heritage, as their mother was of the Vanyar clan, while Finarfin himself is half Vanyar as well, though their father is of the Noldor, and they are technically considered Noldor elves. Among humans, those who are bestowed the title of being wise are lore masters and keepers of their ancient history and knowledge that most of their kindred seem to have forgotten about, such as Adonel and Andreth from the First Age, the people of Numenor during the Second Age, and Faramir, and for a time his father, Denethor, Steward of Gondor, from the Third Age. And even though they're not normally paired with the word wisdom, I think you can also consider the dwarves, in particular the dwarves of Belagos and Khazad-dûm, also among the wise, given that Belagos, during the First Age, did not go to war with the Sindarin elves of Doriath like the other kindred, and also Khazad-dûm because of their friendship with the Noldor during the Second Age, and their aid during the wars with Sauron. However, part of what makes wisdom so ambiguous is the fact that it contains the mentioned elements before of information, power, and knowledge, and therefore it could be easy for characters and fans to assume that knowledge equals wisdom, or that one cannot have wisdom without the power to enact or enforce it. Indeed, one cannot help but notice that the wise many times prove to be not so wise, often being deceived, corrupted, overpowered, or even killed by others who either have more power and who are more cunning. It might be a fair question to ask that should not the villains who committed these crimes also be considered wise because of their more effective use of their knowledge and power against those of the good guys. For example, Sauron during the Second Age is perceived as being wise before his fall during the fall of Numenor, when it stripped him of his physical appearance of that as a wise person. Yet before that fall, he deceived nearly everyone he came across in Middle-earth. Add to this, you could easily argue that though their followers consider them the wisest beings in Arda, that the Valar themselves are in fact, for the most part, not being very wise, given that Morgoth fools them on 2 occasions, even though they fought with them beforehand. Vaynor and many of the Noldor elves consider the Valar not so wise and rebel against them after Morgoth's last deception cost them the loss of their first High King, Finwë, and the theft of the Silmarils, something the Valar also failed to perceive as a possibility. And to add to this, arguably their lack of involvement in Middle-earth proper, with the exception of Umo, overall is considered by some to be not so wise as well, even by Urul, the supreme god of that universe himself, because it not only allowed evil to grow in Middle-earth both before and after Morgoth's return, but also nearly results in the near genocide of all the human and Noldor elf cultures that were living in Beleriand, and ultimately results in the destruction of half the continent itself. And lastly, they failed to perceive what the gift of longer lives would do to the people of Numenor, that it would eventually drive them to want immortality and become more susceptible to corruption, even without Sauron's help. And if one were to follow, honestly, this more cynical point of view, that the only real wisdom that the Valar showed was sending the Istari to Middle-earth instead of armies during the Third Age to stop the spread of Sauron prematurely before it got out of hand, like it did during the First Age. However, this isn't a blame game, and all the races of Middle-earth are susceptible to the questioning of the validity of wisdom based on mistakes that they made. Take the Elves, for example, considered to be the wisest among the races of Middle-earth. The Vanyar, considered the wisest of all the elves in all of Arda, for the most part are a non-factor within the histories of Middle-earth, even though they are considered the wisest among all those peoples, given that their only real involvement comes at the end of the First Age during the apocalyptic War of Wrath, but otherwise isolate themselves from even their own kindred in Valinor. And, as I mentioned before, Finarfin's children are considered the wisest among the Noldor, and yet they still chose to follow Fëanor and the Noldor to Middle-earth to wage war against Morgoth and retrieve the Silmarils, a choice which results in nearly all of their deaths, with the exception of Galadriel. This is made even more tragic when you consider that other of the Noldor who are considered not so wise lived longer than they did, even though they too eventually died. And this failure of perception haunts the Noldor even into the Second Age, when Celebrimbor, who is also considered among the wise, falls for Sauron's deception to make the Rings of Power, something that results in his death as well. When it comes to human wisdom, it is more prone to corruption, whether that be from mixed or false narratives told in their histories, or current existential events going on in their current lives that warp their personalities to the point where their wisdom fails, such as the aforementioned fall of Numenor, Denethor's slow deterioration to the use of the Palantir during the Third Age, and, if you follow the movies, Faramir agreeing to go on a suicidal charge because he wanted his father's acceptance, even though he knew it was a bad idea to begin with. And as for the dwarves, ever since the loss of Khazad-dûm during the Third Age thanks to the Balrog, they are considered more greedy than wise, more isolationist than helpful citizens of Middle-earth. The point being that for all the praise that wisdom gets, practically it doesn't seem that great, at least at first glance. So therefore this begs the question, what makes it so special? Why is wisdom to be praised in the world of Middle-earth? Well, to begin with, I think the philosophy of wisdom gains its praise from the fact that it is unique from knowledge or power, in that it has an awareness of where that knowledge, information, or power is going to take you. Take the Noldor, for example. They are the smartest and most knowledgeable of all the elves in Arda, yet often fall to deception or emotional conflicts. This is why it seems almost like knowledge is spoken of as being a bad thing, and why during the Second Age, that Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, and Gil-galad are considered wise for not falling to Sauron's snares of the Rings of Power and the promise of knowledge. And speaking of Sauron, it is even said that he started out as seeking knowledge and order as a servant of the Vala Aule, and therefore you could almost consider him wise before he was turned by Morgoth. And in Middle-earth, wisdom is tied to a certain morality, so being the strongest or living the longest does not inherently make you worthy of being wise or the equivalent of it. Hence why evil forces are often stronger and more cunning than the good guys. The good guys' values is not as much in the victory, even though it would have helped them given that so many of them would get killed, but in the substance of their lives and how they live them and the choices that they make and how they conduct themselves. What they pass on to Middle-earth down the line rather than victory in the moment. Perhaps the most disturbing point of Middle-earth wisdom is how much it seems that people in it rely so much on the appearance of a person to consider them wise. This is how Morgoth and Sauron were so easily able to convince others of their false intentions. From the Valar to elves to dwarves to men and so on. And on the one hand, it's understandable. One can be so taken by the beauty of a Valar or Maiar or an elf that it's easy to consider them that they must be wiser, smarter, and more knowledgeable than you, and therefore have good intentions for you as well. While on first appearance looking at a dwarf, you just see a stunted, greedy and hot-tempered person who is more likely to fight you than they are to help you or give you a piece of wisdom that is useful. And this serves to low-key the point that the reliance on appearance is often what sabotages people's wisdom when they're trying to discern what is right and wrong. Just because something appears beautiful or wise or even easy does not mean it is so, and oftentimes it can be the opposite. But on to the final point, which is, how is wisdom seen overall by the peoples of Middle-earth, who are not considered among the wise? I think that the average person in Middle-earth, be they Hobbit, or human, or dwarf, or a merchant, or a soldier, often viewed wisdom as something of a luxury. For example, the fall of Numenor is supposed to be considered a great loss because in part of the destruction of so much knowledge that they inherited from their ancestors and that they themselves learned as well. Yet, to the average human working in the fields, the horsemen on the plains, or merchants working in the cities, they've never heard of any of this lore or knowledge beforehand, much less possibly of even Numenor itself. Therefore, other than the relief that the Numenorians won't be coming after them to sacrifice them anymore, the destruction of the island of Numenor probably means very little to them. The same argument could be made for the Sindar elves of Beleriand, and especially the Sylvan elves east of Beleriand. In both cases, they have scarcely heard of the Valar, and maybe of their ancient relatives who migrated to Valinor so long ago. But it mattered very little in their day-to-day lives, at least for the Sindar until the wars began. But even more so for the Sylvan elves who never saw those wars. So I think wisdom is seen almost like a secret power, or maybe even a cult, in a sense that a rare few could attain it or become part of the inner circle that would be called wise. It was seen as a blending together of the factors that I mentioned earlier: power, knowledge, information, and wisdom itself, and therefore, to anyone outside of that, they would all be considered more or less the same thing, as long as, of course, they weren't trying to kill them at that time. And that's the real crux of it as well, is that once that door is opened, other influences may come in to try and turn it, or turn the person seeking it into something that they themselves never thought they would be. And more often than not, wisdom comes at a great cost, as those who have attained wisdom have often suffered much and lost many in order to be finally considered among the wise.